Good afternoon and welcome to this latest episode of Quaestionare in English. I'm Sam Stone, professor of law at the Universidad de las Americas Puebla. I'm joined today by Toño Montes, a student of ours in the departments of International Relations and Political Science. Toño, welcome as usual. It's great to see you again and to get a chance to talk about all of the latest in the bilateral relationship between Mexico and the United States, and also to discuss a little bit about what's going on at the G7 meeting that is happening in the United Kingdom this week. But before we get to any of that, we really do want to start with what's been happening between Mexico and the U.S. We haven't, been on air for a couple of weeks, and we wanted to sort of get back to that, but especially focus in on what happened in the last week or so, which was the big midterm election, congressional election, and local election in Mexico, and also the visit by Vicepresident Kamala Harris of the United States to Mexico, the first foreign trip by either the U.S. president currently or the U.S. vice president. So let's begin with this, right? Toño, maybe we can start off, you can give us a little bit of a recap of what happened in the election. This was a big election, both for, for all sides politically in Mexico, for the President López Obrador and his supermajority that he previously had in the House of Representatives here, which is called the Chamber of Deputies, and for the opposition parties who were trying to take away that supermajority. So what happened here this past Sunday? What were the results?
Yes, so thank you, Doctor, for having me here in the program once again. Yes, we had the largest elections in modern Mexico's history since democracy started. And these elections were especially interesting and also important, let's say, because we didn't only elected 15 governors, 15 of the 32 governorships that are being elected, but also we were able to, for the first time, re-elect congressmen in the federal Chamber of Deputies, and also we elected the whole 500 of them, 300 districts and 200 seats by proportional representation. That's the electoral system of Mexico. Is a mixed system, not like the United States that you elect the whole 435 members of the House, if I'm correct. The thing is that the president had a supermajority, as you said, and he had more than 333 members of Congress, deputies. So that means that he had this constitutional majority that allowed him to do that, to change the constitution on the basis or on the matters that he wanted to. The outcome of these elections, last Sunday's elections, resulted in a majority for his party, for Morena, National Regeneration Movement, but he didn't want this constitutional majority, this qualified majority. He won around 200 seats, and he will have by proportional representation around 300, but he is short 30 benches for having this qualified majority, and he will not be able by himself or by just the support of his parties, which is the Workers' Party and Morena Party and the Green Party as well, to change the constitution. He will have to negotiate with the opposition parties that gained a lot of seats that they lost in 2018, because in 2018 it was a blasting majority that Morena won, not only in the Chamber of Deputies, but also in the Senate. So let's remember that we didn't elect the Senate in this election. The Senate, we elected the whole Senate every 6 years. And the next election of the Senate is in 2024. So they still have control over the Senate, but not a qualified majority. And they do not have a qualified majority now in the Chamber of Deputies. So that's something positive, because it means that they will have to negotiate with the other parts to make changes into the Constitution. So I think that was the milestone that was set to achieve for Mexican democracy, to have these checks and balances that we needed. Doctor,
I apologize. That's kind of the biggest takeaway, right, at the end of all this, is that the president's party and his allies, right, there are really three parties, his party and two others, as you said, right, won't be able to change the Constitution as easily as they have so far. In fact, they won't be able to change it at all unless they get support from some of the opposition parties. And just as a reminder, right, to our viewers, Mexico is a multi-party democracy, unlike the US. Really, there are arguably three major parties. Perhaps it's really only two now, but arguably three, and then you have a series of smaller parties. But because of the proportional representation system and the alliances that are made between parties in every election, they all get, or at least many of the smaller parties get some seats in the Chamber of Deputies, in the Senate, and so they have some representation. The other side, though, right, of the election was that the president's party and his allies did win a number of governorships. In fact, out of the 15 governorships you mentioned that were in play, their parties won a total of 11 of those, which I believe brings a total number of governorships that his party and his allies control to 17 of the 32. So that was also a big piece of the puzzle here, right? Unusual, where fairly unusual for Mexico. There seems to maybe have been some ticket splitting, or maybe simply the president's party would have had a much bigger victory at the state level if his support in Congress, support for members of Congress would have been the same as it was 3 years ago. But anyway, big election in Mexico. And we're putting this out there in order to contextualize Vice President Harris's visit, because she came to Mexico. She arrived the day after the election. She held meetings here with Mexican leaders, including the Mexican president, less than 48 hours after the election. And I thought maybe you could also start us off a little bit with that, right? What was going on with this visit? Why was Vice President Harris here? Why did it matter so much, especially here in Mexico, right? It was kind of the news of the day, of the week, of the month. I mean, it was what everybody was sort of focused on for days and weeks before she arrived in Mexico. So why was this seen as being such a crucial visit for Mexico, for the United States, for the bilateral relationship? And then maybe why, or rather, what sort of were the results of it? Did it really achieve anything? Was it kind of just for show? Who was the intended audience if it was for show? We can get a little bit into that and have a discussion here.
Yeah, so basically Vice President Harris came on June the 8th, one day after the general election that we had. And this was really interesting because she changed the whole narrative. The press was starting to talk about her and stop talking about the election. So we had a twist in the political agenda in those days, and I think it was a pretty positive visit because, again, she reaffirms the commitment that she has been in charge of the migration of the southern border affairs, including obviously Mexico is the southern border, but not only Mexico, because she also visited Guatemala. And she met also with the Guatemalan president. And this visit, it was a representative visit because it showed that she cares about Mexico. And let's remember that the last time that a senior political officer of the United States talking about president or vice president visited Mexico, it was in 2015, if I'm not wrong, the last time former President Barack Obama came into Mexico and visited our former president, Enrique Peña Nieto. So Donald Trump came into Mexico, but as a candidate, not as a president. And as a president, he didn't visit Mexico at all. So that's something weird because most of the United States presidents intend to visit Mexico at some point of their administration. So this Biden-Harris administration shows that they care about this strong bond that they have with Mexico, not only in trade, but also in social and political affairs, that they care about how to address as a bloc the migration issue that is a permanent point in the United States and Mexico bilateral agenda. So the key situation or the key points that we could show off about Kamala Harris' visit to Mexico was that first, it was a really short visit. It was an express visit. She arrived at 11 p.m. of, I believe, of Monday at 11 p.m. She stayed till Tuesday at 6 p.m. where she left to Washington once again. But she had a busy agenda those hours that she was here. She had a meeting with President López Obrador, and their teams, and their foreign affairs team. It was our Chancellor Marcelo Ebrard. It was the in charge of at the interim the replacement of the ambassador until a new ambassador is said to be appointed, which is another interesting topic because they haven't appointed an ambassador into Mexico. There are rumors that probably Ken Salazar could take the office, but there's not anything concrete yet. So she had this meeting with President López Obrador team. Then she had a meeting with women entrepreneurs in Mexico City as well. And also she visited the embassy where reportedly she had a virtual meeting with probably businessmen or some other interest groups, but she had a really tight agenda. And just as a curious fact, when she left Mexico, she ordered several orders of tacos into the Air Force too, for the crew and for her, because she really liked something positive, showing Mexico's soft power into United States diplomacy. But yeah, that's about it with the visit of Vice President Kamala Harris. It was pretty express and pretty packed visit.
Yeah, I think it was pretty significant, right? That they decided to, for American president or vice president to make the first trip of either of them abroad to Mexico and Guatemala. I think that shows, that was intended to show, right, that, like you said, that the U.S. cares and that this administration is really going to look at solving regional problems regionally and not kind of having the Trump approach, which was basically, I care what happens within our borders, but whatever happens on the other side of the Rio Grande is your problem. And so I think this is a shift that is going to really change the dynamics of the relationship going forward, hopefully, right? Apparently the meetings were productive. There were some, relatively few, but some concrete results. But overall, right, both Vice President Harris and President López Obrador came out of it saying that it had been very useful, that it had been a good meeting, they had good conversations. And Vice President Harris gave a press conference after her meetings with the president of Guatemala, and then here after her meeting with the president of Mexico. And she said some things that were seen as being somewhat controversial back home in the United States. On the one hand, she told people in Central America to simply not go to the United States, that if you're thinking about, going to the US border, don't come, you're probably going to get turned away, right? And that received some criticism from the left. On the other hand, she got asked a ridiculous number of times by different reporters whether she was going to go to the border, right? And her role in the administration is not to be sort of a border czar, but rather to try to address these issues of immigration at their root, which is sort of what she was trying to do here in Mexico and in Central America. And yet she got many questions about the border, and then a lot of attacks from many attacks from the right about why hasn't she visited the border? And there was a lot of controversy surrounding those. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about that, right? Why did she say what she say? What were the responses from the left and the right? Was it a mistake? Was it calculated? What do you think?
Once again, I do believe that the southern affairs in U.S.-Mexico border, southern referring to United States, obviously, is a state policy. You cannot change the migration policy one day to another. It's pretty difficult to first of all pass legislation in that matter because of the controversy that generates. There's not a bipartisan agreement on that matter. So that makes that the vice president had to take a position that President Biden had already taken months ago. He said that it wasn't safe to travel to the Mexico border. He said it at that time because of COVID. He said that it wasn't safe to travel and they were not going to let them pass because of COVID. And President Harris, she didn't say it explicitly because of COVID, but she said that she wasn't comfortable or she asked not to go to the United States. This was obviously not well received by some parts of the Democratic Party in the United States, especially this progressive group that we know as a team of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, of Ilhan Omar, and other congresswomen. Yeah, most of the congresswomen that are very progressive with their migration policies, not only because they're migrants or their parents were migrants at some point, because they have a common view that is the United States, a country that was built with migrants. So Kamala Harris, being a son of migrants, referring in the southern border of Mexico to do not come to the United States, it was pretty weird to see, because you would expect a different discourse. But once again, this foreign policy is a state policy for the United States. You cannot change migration policy one day to another. It has to happen, or it has to have a process in order to change it. I think it was pretty questionable what she said. She probably could have said it more soft. But again, Kamala is not a soft woman. She's pretty hard with her declarations. She's pretty straight. She was an attorney. She was the Attorney General of California. She's used to being key or straight to the point that she means. And I think that was Kamala being Kamala. That's her personality. She's pretty straight on what she said. Again, some of the political sectors in the United States, some Republicans could assimilate this being a positive thing. But yet the Republicans yet criticize her because they're used to Donald Trump going to the border every 2 months to evaluate the construction of the wall. But the wall has been stopped. There's not anything else to evaluate. That's why she is not going to the border, or she has no immediately emergency affair to go to the border that requires her presence there. There are some other officers that are in charge of the border that they have their own business there, that there's no need for Kamala to go to the border if it's not like a show or propaganda kind of event where she showed that she cares and she's in the border. But that was a Trump thing, that he was the guy that went to the border several times, not Kamala. And I think that's where the Biden administration wants to differentiate that. We care about migration affairs, but we do not need to go to the border every month to show that we care.
Yeah, I mean, we live in the era of the internet, so
yeah,
you don't necessarily have to go in person to be able to do many things and know exactly what's going on down there. On the other hand, of course, she hasn't visited the border as vice president, but as a senator from a border state prior to being vice president, right, from California. As she said, she's been there multiple times, and I think they have a very good grasp of what is happening. But yeah, I agree with you, right? She could have phrased that differently. She could have maybe been more nuanced. Of course, nuance is difficult in politics, especially when things are as polarized as they are today. But the message, I think to some degree is simply the trip is dangerous no matter what, right? Crossing multiple countries, if you're coming from like Honduras, right? Crossing multiple countries by land in these conditions of poverty, with all of the violence that happens against migrants when they're crossing through Mexico, when they're crossing through Central American countries. It's dangerous no matter what. You add COVID into the equation, right? And then you add the fact that the US is still, like you said, trying to sort of evolve its immigration policy and actually try to restore the basic infrastructure needed to be able to evaluate all the asylum claims and so on that was just devastated under the Trump administration. It's, I think that was really the message, is if you come now, you're probably not going to get in. You're probably going to be waiting for a long time. You might just get sent back, right? And so sort of evaluate those risks. But the way I think that she said it was what led many people like AOC, right, and others to respond to that the way they did. So it was an interesting visit. I think for the most part, there were things that came out of it that were positive in the bilateral relationship. There were, I think it establishes the importance that the U.S. is giving to Mexico and to Latin America, at least the sort of northern half of Latin America in this administration. But at the end of the day, I think a lot of it was for the internal consumption of the public in each country, right? López Obrador, sort of his stature is enhanced by meeting with the U.S. president or vice president, especially after, an election which, showed mixed results for his party. And on the other hand, Vice President Harris coming here shows the American public, right, that she's doing something on this issue. I think for those of us who, really follow this question, I think most of us would agree with what she said multiple times, which was that most migrants don't want to go to the U.S. right? They don't want to leave their homes. That's not the whole purpose. Nobody wakes up in the morning and is like, oh man, today I just really want to go to the States. No, right? People leave because they're either hungry or because they're under sort of threats of massive violence that they're fleeing from. And that's been the reality for many, many decades, right? Maybe there was a time when people migrated to the US from Europe or other places in search of democracy and freedom. But really, most people who migrate to the US today, especially without documents, are going because they can't feed their families or because they're going to get shot if they stay home. And they take these incredibly dangerous trips across Mexico and across Central America to get to the US. And she said that, she recognized it. I think that was fundamental. And she said it multiple times. I think the Obama administration had realized this, had talked about it, but I had not heard an American president or vice president say what she said as clearly, right? Is basically, we understand what's going on. We want to make sure that we can help create opportunities for you in your countries, right? I mean, even for Mexico, immigration from Mexico to the US had been declining for many years, declining quite a bit. And since the pandemic began, that's ticking back up. And so I think the idea that, hey, we want to help you as the United States, you want to help Mexico and Central America develop opportunities for your own people in your own country so you don't have to leave, I think that's accurate. And that was sort of a piece that's missing from the conversation, maybe amongst the public in the US, where the conversation is always, oh, how do we keep them out? Or how do we let them in, right? But not sort of, okay, why are people coming? And I think that is discussed, obviously, amongst those of us who deal with these issues. But amongst the general public, I think that's not really discussed, at least in the United States. And hopefully the way she addressed it would, will lead to that being a bigger part of the discussion. I don't know, any other thoughts about this visit, about how it's going to play out, what's going to happen here? You're right? There's still no U.S. ambassador to Mexico, which is not necessarily essential, right? Embassies continue to run without ambassadors, but it's sort of interesting that there's been this emphasis placed on the relationship with Mexico, and yet there's no ambassador. I don't know. Anything else you want to comment on this before we?
Yeah, Trump took so long to appoint Landau, and it seems that Biden is taking its time to appoint the new ambassador. Or I don't know. It seems that Mexico just take a week to appoint a new ambassador, or a day, but the United States wants to take its time. Again, being the ambassador of Mexico into the United States it's a cabinet level position. Not like into the United States, like being the ambassador to Mexico is not like being the ambassador to United Nations. And here in Mexico, being the ambassador to the United Nations is not as important as being ambassador to the United States. So you can see the relevance of both offices. But just to finish this topic, I wanted to say that it seems that President Biden cares about the root causes of migration, and he's showing that he cares in those acts, or in these special symbols that he makes, like sending Vice President Kamala to Mexico. It shows that this government will address at some point the root causes of migration, and is addressing them at their pace, but they're doing the work that is needed to be done at some point.
Yeah, I agree. I think what you said, about how the sort of Mexican ambassador to the U.S. has this extremely prominent position within the Mexican government. That's sort of just a very clear indicator of how the relationship is viewed from each side. And we've mentioned this before, but I'll just sort of finish out with this, which is that in Mexico, the relationship with the U.S. is everything, right? I mean, anytime there's anything going on in the relationship, or the president says something about the United States, that's national news. And it's all over the news for days and days in Mexico. Whereas in the U.S., right, I think if you ask the general public, if you polled them, I think most Americans have no idea there was a midterm election in Mexico less than a week ago. I don't think that the American public in general knows that what the president of Mexico's name is, or anything of the sort. So there's definitely a very different perspective in Mexico amongst the general public. Anything with the U.S. is big news. In the U.S., not so much. And the fact that the ambassadorships to each country are sort of have different levels of significance, I think sort of highlights that. But all right, well, for a few minutes here, before we wrap up, I do want to talk about the G7, right? The meeting of sort of the 7, big democratic capitalist countries of the world, supposedly, right? A group of countries that created this group, this organization back in the 1970s, at a time when they represented about 80% of the world's gross domestic product, but that today, in 2021, only represent about 45% of the world's gross domestic product, with the rise of China and India and all sorts of other countries right across the globe sort of eating into their share of the global GDP. This is a group that usually gets together, right? The leaders of it get together in different countries every year. They have these meetings. They try to come up with clear sort of paths forward or messages that they can send together on the big global issues. So, Tonya, maybe you can start us off here. Again, what's going on at the G7 this year? What's different? What's the same? What are they trying to do this year? What are some of the topics, the core topics on the table? And yeah, we'll go from there.
Yeah, I would like to quote Joe Biden's tweet: "Diplomacy is back." So yeah, this is one of the major events of diplomacy, of world diplomacy, because the Western powers, the seven Western powers, United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Japan, Russia not anymore, but Italy, France, and also I think I'm missing European Union, Germany, yes, and Germany gathered and they tried to fix the world in a week, basically. No, they deal several topics regarding the global situation, especially in the topic of this G7 will be once again and the COVID vaccination process and the distribution of the vaccines, and also the world economic reactivation. That is something that is already happening. We can see the growth of the countries by trimester. They're growing at extremely high pace. Yeah, because they decreased a lot of their economies last year, but they're starting to grow. So that means that there are more jobs being created. So that's something positive to the world. The exports are growing, the imports are growing into every country. So that's something positive. What we can highlight about this G7 is that, let's see, United Kingdom and the United States have almost their entire population fully vaccinated, or at least with one dose. So that means that we can see from now on these two countries being extremely, friendly to the other countries of the world, giving out vaccines, starting to make their factories, their vaccine factories work for another countries, like making new contracts for them. And I think that's something positive, because once again, the pandemic is not set to be over until most of the world is fully vaccinated. So I think that is going to be the key point about G7. I don't think it's going to be about global security. There's not a major threat. And again, the terrorism is still a thing in the Middle East, but it's not the main concern for the countries right now. That's what I can assess about G7.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a decent amount of consensus on the COVID issue. There are some fault lines, right? The U.S. has came out in favor of lifting patent restrictions on the vaccines to allow, right, basically say we're not going to enforce patents, right? If anybody else wants to make these vaccines abroad outside the U.S., you can. The Europeans have actually come out against that, or at least are skeptical about that. Their idea is that, well, you need to make sure that the U.S. in particular, right, is allowing the components of the vaccines, right, the different ingredients to be shipped outside the U.S. so that countries can make the vaccines outside the U.S. So there's some fault lines there, but for the most part, yeah, right, there's a common goal. They want to get this over. They want to try to wrap up the pandemic by the end of next year, including in four countries, developing countries in Africa and all over the world, Latin America, right, where the pandemic is raging. And I think there's going to be some agreement there, right? But we're seeing also all sorts of disagreements on other things, right? On the one hand, as you said, diplomacy's back, right? Everybody's extremely happy that Joe Biden's there, as Politico Europe put it in an article from yesterday, that European leaders are treating Biden like an old friend, even if they're not old friends, right? Emmanuel Macron had never met Joe Biden until these last few days, and yet, right, he was seen like with his arm around Joe and then walking arm in arm and talking animatedly. So everyone's really excited, right, to have somebody who's not Donald Trump, let's just be honest, right, in the U.S. presidency at these meetings. Because in previous years, what had happened, Trump would show up and everybody was kind of trying to manage Trump and hoping that he wouldn't like explode and suddenly change U.S. policy. And that's not happening now, right? They might disagree with the U.S. on certain things, but at the end of the day, if you're a European leader, if you're Ursula von der Leyen, or if you are Angela Merkel, or if you're Macron, you know that US policy is set, you know that it's predictable, you know what to expect. And those are good things in foreign policy. You do not want, someone like Trump running your foreign policy. So I think on that end, even though we're going to see disagreements about, how to get the world vaccinated, about China, right? China's been a big topic. The US wants the EU and its allies in general to sort of come on board and have a stronger stance against China on everything, right? From human rights to trade practices to its sort of expansionist ideas in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. And the Europeans are kind of skeptical of trying to confront China as strongly as the US wants them to, right? There are disagreements about Russia. Some countries in the EU want the US to try to stop or sanction the companies and people who are building the Nord Stream 2 pipeline between Russia and Germany, but Germany, of course, wants it, right, to ship natural gas and petroleum over to Germany directly from Russia. So there are these fault lines. There are going to be divisions. But as I've said before, also about the US-Mexico relationship, that's normal, right? Any friends, come on, just think about it on a personal level, right? You with your friends and your family, you don't always agree on everything. But at the end of the day, if you have a solid relationship, that doesn't matter. You're going to work through it. You're going to figure it out. And you're going to be able to get past these things and try to resolve them in a way that's beneficial for everybody. And that's, I think, what's happening now, is that despite these divisions, despite these fault lines, European leaders, for the most part, want to work with the US. They much prefer a US that has a clear, stable, defined, multilateral foreign policy perspective than one which is, completely unpredictable, as was Donald Trump. And I think that that's what we're seeing. So it's positive overall. The fact that we're talking now about sort of the issues at the G7 summit, what they're actually discussing, is a positive thing, right?
Yeah.
Previous in the last few years, it was all Trump. So.
Yeah, the positive thing is that it's not around the United States or Donald Trump anymore. It's around the world. So that's a positive thing.
Yeah. And in the long term, for example, Prime Minister Johnson, who's the host of this G7 summit, invited, for example, the Prime Minister of India and leaders from South Africa and Australia and a few other countries, right, that are not part of the G7, but they're sort of there as guests. And I think that's a positive thing, right? How is this group going to remain relevant going forward? Again, they now represent less than half of the world's GDP. Do they need to include countries like India, which has its own human rights and sort of, backsliding of democracy under the current prime minister? Should they include countries with smaller GDPs, but who are sort of now, have become, stronger, more stable democracies? I don't know, right? But I think these are the sorts of things that now can be discussed and can be looked at and can be thought out, because not everybody's just waiting to see what Donald Trump's going to tweet out next and change foreign policy. So it's a big development. I think this is overall going to be a good meeting. I'm curious to see the next few days what the actual result is. I think there might be some substance, but not as much as maybe many people would have hoped. The other big issue they're discussing, obviously, is related to the UK's withdrawal from the EU. All of these issues relating to Ireland, the Irish and Northern Irish border, and what's going to happen with that, between the EU and the UK. But at the end of the day, I think we'll have some substantive results, not as much as maybe some people would have hoped, but sort of a return to what these meetings look like under Democratic and Republican presidents prior to President Trump.
Yes.
So, all right. Well, I think with that, we might start wrapping this up. I think we've had a good conversation about what is going on in the bilateral relationship, what is going on at the G7, and make sure to follow us on TV Udlap, Facebook Live, on YouTube Live. We are on intermittently, but we are on, and we will continue to bring you news and information and perspectives on what is happening between the US and Mexico, this vitally important relationship that way too often in the United States does not get as much attention as it should. So thank you very much, and have a good afternoon.